You are listening to the Writer's Block. I am horror author James Hershey Jr. It's time for a truth bomb. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Writer's Block. I am your host, horror author James Hershey Jr. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about something that most people probably don't even know is a thing. It's another show in the homesteading series, and today's topic is going to be vermiculture. Now, you might be asking yourself, what in the blue hell is vermiculture? Vermiculture is just a fancy way of saying worm farming. And what it is people raise worms, basically. That's what it is. The worms are your livestock. Now, there's several different reasons why people raise worms. The obvious one is for fishing. So you have worm farms that grow worms for use for fishing. They grow the regular old Nightcrawlers, and people buy them in those little tubs for bait. But what we're going to be talking about tonight is a different form of vermiculture. It is a form that is used for worm castings, is what they call it. It's basically the worm poop, you might as well say. What happens is certain kinds of worms, they eat organic matter. And once the organic matter passes through their system, the worm actually feeds on the microorganisms that live inside the matter, and the rest of it gets passed through their intestines and everything and out through the back end. Well, while it's traveling through, the enzymes inside of the worm's digestive tract change it into soil, basically. It's like a super soil. It's the most fertile and best fertilizer on earth, and that's the reason for vermiculture, for worm farming now. There's like three main worms that people use. Okay, you have the red wiggler worm, which is a smaller worm, and it's the very best composting worm there is. It eats up to its own weight every day and produces castings. It multiplies like mad. If you buy like a pound of red wiggler worms, that's roughly around 1,000 worms. By the end of 1 year, you will have 500,000 worms. That's how much this thing multiplies. So it very quickly will turn into a major undertaking if you're not prepared for it. The red wiggler worm is the best, but the problem with the red wiggler and all composting worms is that they're not native to our area, so they can't stand really low temperatures. So they tend to die in the wintertime if they get too cold. They like it anywhere from the lowest they can go is around the freezing point, around 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And they like it in between 40 and like 90 to 100 is their sweet spot. Somewhere in that range of temperature, they're just happy as can be. Now, most people, when they have worm farms, what they do is they take and they make themselves a worm bin. Okay, and a worm bin can be anything from just a plastic tote to the different towers and stuff like that you can actually buy that are specially made for worms. But let's do the plastic tote thing first, because that's the one that you can do at home without having to spend any money at all, really, other than what it costs for the tote. So basically what you do is you get yourself a tote and you drill some holes in it to allow a little bit of drainage, and you put it inside of another tote of the same size. Then you fill your tote with shredded newspaper, broken up egg cartons, not the styrofoam, the recyclable cardboard ones. You can put table scraps, fruits and veggies in there with it. shredded newspaper, shredded regular paper, sawdust, all those things the worms will eat. They love coffee grounds because they have a real high nitrogen content. It's one of their favorite things. And they love cornmeal. Some people will sprinkle a little bit of sand in there, but either the cornmeal or the sand, it does basically the same thing. Since worms don't have teeth, they need something with a little bit of grit that helps them grind up the food that they eat and helps digest it. But what you do is you put all that stuff in and you put your worms in. Now the worms will eat all that, okay? But you got to moisten it. That's another thing. Get yourself a spray bottle and spray it down. Keep it moist because that's how they drink. The worms will start eating. And like I said, the red wigglers, they'll eat their own body weight in a day, every day. So they'll start eating, and as they're eating, they'll be producing worm castings out the back end, which is basically what you would put in with your garden and stuff like that. It's a great fertilizer. It's black. It looks like soil is what it looks like. And about 3 months later, all of the material that you put in there is gone, and you have to change it out and put new in. Now you have the red wiggler worms, like I was saying. The other two major composting worms that there are is the African Nightcrawler and the European Nightcrawler. Now both of these worms are much larger than the red wiggler worm. They don't eat quite as much, which is kind of weird because they're a bigger worm, but they don't eat as much as the red wiggler worm does. But they don't eat as much, they don't make as many castings or as quickly, and they don't reproduce as quickly as the red wiggler worm does. So you're not going to have such a large explosion of worm population if you get yourself a bin and you put those in it. The other good point about the African Nightcrawler and the European Nightcrawler is they make perfect bait worms for fishing. So you can have a dual use thing going, you know what I mean? You can have your composting worm that will make your worm castings to add to your garden, and you will also have, once they do start, because they do still multiply, you know what I mean, just like any other animal, but they do multiply faster than normal animals, just not as fast as the red wiggler, but you still will end up with quite a bit of worms after a while. So then you can also sell some of your worms for bait, you know, in the fishing industry, and you can use them yourself for bait and that kind of thing. So that's always a bonus. They also don't like it below freezing. So what most people do is they take their worm bins, and you can do inside and outside. If you have an outside worm bin, what they will do is actually bring it inside over the winter to keep it in the temperature that the worms like, and that way they don't die over the winter. But there is a way to have your worms outside in the winter without having to bring them into your house, and to keep them alive and happy and healthy and still eating and still multiplying and still having a great time. And not a lot of people know about this secret. Most people that do worm farming think that you have to bring them inside, but here's what you do. Everybody is familiar with composting, I would imagine. If you're listening to this show, I imagine you probably know what composting is. Composting, for those that don't know, is when you take organic matter, such as leaves, grass clippings, shredded paper, cardboard, fruits and vegetable scraps, just weeds, leaves, whatever. Organic material, sawdust, wood, twigs, and you make a big pile of it. You wet that pile down, okay? The inside of that pile, if you get the pile to about 3 feet tall, the inside of that pile is going to heat up, okay? Because all these little microorganisms go to work, and they start breaking down the organic material that you've piled up extremely rapidly. Now, the inside of that pile, when it's cooking at its optimum, can reach all the way up to anywhere from 150 to 190 degrees inside there. It'll get so hot that literally when you stick the pitchfork into it and turn over part of the pile, you'll see steam coming off and smoke coming out of it. That's how hot they will get. Now, if you have a big compost pile like that, like I do here at my place, I have a very large compost pile like that. If you have one of those, what you can do is you can take your red wiggler worms or your African nightcrawlers or your European nightcrawlers, and you can put them into your compost pile. And they will very happily live there, and they will just eat away at all that stuff that you put in your pile. You know, they'll eat the leaves, they'll eat the paper, they'll eat the cardboard, they'll eat the fruit and veggies, they'll eat the wood, they'll eat everything that's in that pile. And they will do the same thing that they do in the bins, which is create worm poop, worm castings, which is exactly what you're looking for if you are worm farming, basically. Okay? So if you put them in this giant pile, what happens is they will find their sweet spot in there. Okay, they can't go to the very center of the pile where it's going to be 150 degrees because they can't survive that kind of temperature. But what they will do is they will start out on the very exterior of the pile, and they will work their way towards the center until they find that sweet spot where they're happy. And when it gets colder outside, they'll move closer to the center of your compost pile. So as the temperature drops, they move closer, they stay warm, they stay alive, they stay happy. Everything's wonderful for them. I have actually seen red wiggler worms survive winters where the temperature got below zero. I mean, you're talking -5, -10 degrees outside. You're talking snow on the ground, ice everywhere. It's cold as hell. And inside of that compost pile, it could be 70, 80, 90 degrees. You know, not in the very core of it, but around it where they can survive. It's a nice temperature for them. Now, what you have to do is you have to make sure you keep that pile cooking. Okay? For people that compost, you know what I mean when I say keep the pile cooking. For those that don't compost, I'll explain it so that you can understand what I'm talking about. The way a compost pile works is you are putting in your browns and your greens. Okay? Your browns are like your leaves, your shredded papers, your cardboard, your wood scraps, your sawdust, those kind of things. That's your browns. Okay? That is what is going to become your compost. Your greens that you put in, that's going to be your grass clippings, your leaves, or your fresh leaves before they fall off the tree. Once they fall off the tree, they're browns. Okay? Live leaves, greens, dead leaves, browns. But all of your brush that you're cutting, like your green brush, grass clippings, food scraps, veggies, fruits, that kind of thing, that's all going to be greens. Okay? Now what the greens do is they feed all the things that break down the browns. They provide the energy to the pile. They keep the microorganisms happy that break down your pile. So the way to heat up your pile and get it cooking is to add greens to it. So in the wintertime, you want to make sure you put in greens into your pile, because what happens to a compost pile is when you first make the pile and water it down, it begins the process and it starts cooking and it gets very hot. And then you turn your pile. Some people turn it every couple days. Some people turn it every week or two. It varies on the size of your pile and your personal preferences. But usually after you've turned it about 2 to 3 times, it stops cooking and the temperature lowers down and it doesn't get to that high temperature anymore. Now how you remedy that, what you do is you add more greens to the mix to get it cooking again. Okay? And if you want to slow down the cooking, you add more browns. If your pile is slimy and stinks, that's because you have too many greens in it. So you add more browns to it, and that balances your pile. If your pile's not cooking, it's not getting hot enough, and when your pile doesn't get hot enough, that means it's not breaking down and decaying fast enough, so it's not turning into compost. If that happens, then you add more greens. So as you go about the process of composting, and as time goes by, you learn how to balance your compost pile. You get to learn by the smell of it and the temperature of it what you need to add. Okay, some things that you can add in that really help a lot and make your compost super rich and wonderful. Coffee grounds is a great thing to add because it's got a lot of nitrogen in it, and that will really create a very fertile and very rich compost that will just kick ass for your garden. Okay, it'll make your plants grow like you wouldn't believe. I've actually seen tomato plants that were like that little light green color, not that bright beautiful green, but that light green and kind of wilty. And I've seen worm castings being put on it, and I've seen like really rich compost being put on it, and I've seen those things come back and just be unbelievably beautiful, lush green tomato plants. So it makes a hell of a difference in your garden. Okay, nitrogen is a great thing to add to your compost pile. Another thing to add, which is wonderful, is urine, your own pee. Okay, your pee contains urea, which is very high in nitrogen and other things, and that will really kickstart your pile also. So when I say get your pile cooking in the winter, that's what I mean. Is you got to add greens to it. You got to add things to your pile that are going to get it to heat up again. The reason you want that is, one, so that your compost gets done quick and gets done proper, and two, because if you are using your composting worms in your pile, then you want to make sure your pile is cooking over the winter because you don't want all your worms to die. If you allow your pile to cool down, then that internal temperature of your compost pile is not sufficient to keep your red wigglers or your African nightcrawlers or European nightcrawlers alive. Okay, they'll die. So you got to make sure your pile's cooking. So add your greens, add your nitrogen, get that thing working. If you do that, then come springtime, when you pull it back apart, you'll see hundreds or thousands, depending on how many you put in, red wiggler worms, just loving life. And you should have a lot of good compost that'll be very, very rich. Okay, one of the definite advantages to worm composting in your actual compost pile, as opposed to a worm bin, is, well, when you do it in a worm bin, you get all of your worm castings and nothing else. Okay, so you'll have, when you get done with your worm bin, you will have just a bunch of worm castings by themselves, nothing else. When you do it in your compost pile, one, it's more of a natural environment for your worms, so they multiply a lot faster and a lot more. They grow a lot larger because there's way more abundance of food and they're way more comfortable. And they're a lot healthier, okay? So it's better for your worms for them to be in your compost pile than it is to be in a plastic bin sitting in your garage or wherever you put your bin. So that's one thing. Two, you're not going to use straight worm castings as often as you're going to use compost, okay? Your compost goes everywhere. Your compost is going to go throughout your entire garden. You're going to put it around your fruit trees. You're going to use it on your household plants. You're going to use it everywhere, okay? No matter how much compost you make, there's no gardener or farmer that I know that has ever said, damn it, I've got way too much compost here. You know what I mean? That never happens. You always need more compost. You never have enough. So one great thing about putting your worms in your compost pile is it helps your compost get done quicker, because not only do you have the natural processes taking place that creates compost in the first place, but you also have all these worms that are working away, eating the material and turning it into worm castings. So your pile goes faster. Okay? A normal compost pile can be anywhere from 3 to 6 months is what it takes to make compost, depending on the temperature of your compost pile and depending on what you've put in your compost pile and how often you turn your compost pile. If you put big branches and stuff in, it's going to take a lot longer to compost than if you use sawdust. for example. If you're using leaves, if you shred your leaves up, they will compost faster than if you leave them whole. I mean, that's all just common sense stuff. Your worms will actually speed up the process quite a bit. So you can actually get a turnover of less than 3 months for your compost to have good quality compost. And then the other great thing about using your worms in your compost pile itself is not only do you have that rich, beautiful compost, but laced inside that compost is tons of worm castings. And worm castings are the world's greatest fertilizer. There is absolutely nothing that is better for your garden or your trees than worm casting. It's the very best thing you can ever do in the world. It's 100% organic. And then the other great thing about doing this is all of that material that you've put in your compost pile, all the leaves, all the fruits and vegetable scraps, the paper, the cardboard, all that stuff, instead of going to the landfill and creating a bigger problem for society of sitting in a landfill and stinking things up and taking up space, you're actually turning it into something beneficial for your garden and beneficial for the planet, which is a wonderful thing. So there's just so many different advantages to composting in the first place. And then the worm composting is the best way possible you can do it, because it moves so quickly. You know what I mean? And the compost is so much better than it would be just by itself. Now, not only do you have the whole idea of saving the planet, which, I'm no hippie, but anytime you can do something great for the environment, that's wonderful. You know what I mean? And being an American and a capitalist myself, if I can make a buck doing it, that's even better. You know what I mean? And you can definitely make a buck by worm farming. There's many different ways. The first of which is you can simply sell your compost. That's simple. You bag it up, you put it on Craigslist or whatever, and you sell it. Put an ad in the paper, you sell it. Or if you want to go a little larger scale, you can even open up your own little company selling it. You know what I mean? And sell it over the internet and the whole nine. The second way you can make money with this is if you are doing worm bins, you can sell just the worm castings by themselves without the other compost. Now that will bring you more money than your compost will, because worm castings are very, very valuable because, like I said before, they are the world's greatest fertilizer. So you'll make a lot more selling bags of worm castings than you will selling bags of compost. But unfortunately, it takes a lot more worm castings to fill a bag than it does compost. Well, not really. It's the same amount, but it just takes longer to get the worm castings than it takes to get the compost, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You'll get a lot more compost than you will worm castings. But the worm castings are worth more. Now, with the way the worms reproduce and how quickly they reproduce, very soon you can get up and run into where you have a hell of a lot of worms. Okay? Now, you don't have to just do it in your compost pile, but I recommend that. Out of all the ways to raise worms, that's the way I recommend the most, because I think it's a triple threat. It does everything for you. You know what I mean? It's wonderful. But there's other ways. You don't have to do it that way. You don't have to do it in a little tiny plastic worm bin. You can actually build yourself what I call worm tables, okay, which are basically long drawers, you might as well say, that are a couple feet deep, and as long as you want them to be. I mean, if you have a big building or you have a barn or a garage, you could literally build yourself a worm table that's even like 3 foot deep, that spans the entire length of your building if you wanted to, and you could put as many of them in your building as will fit. Basically, all you're doing is you're creating a box with no lid. That's all you're doing. You're creating a giant wooden box with no lid. And in that box, you are going to put a little bit of compost so the worms will feel happy. And for the rest of the bulk of the box, you're going to fill it with shredded paper, shredded cardboard, vegetable scraps, fruit scraps, all the things that you would put in a worm bin anyway or put in your compost pile, you're going to fill these giant boxes with. and then you're just going to put a bunch of worms in them. And they will break down the material just like they do in the compost pile and just like they do in the smaller worm bin. They'll do the exact same thing. But the advantage to having such big worm tables is once you get to a point where your worms are reproducing and you have got a lot of worms, that's going to give you a spot to put them all. You know what I mean? That will give you the capacity to hold 1 million or more worms to where you can really crank out a lot of worm castings. So you're looking at a 2 to 3 month turnaround for a compost pile. Okay? When you're talking about a worm bin, you're looking at 2 to 3 weeks turnaround to where that's going to get processed. Not every bit of it, but enough of it to where you're going to be harvesting out plenty of worm castings from your box. When you harvest out the worm castings, you add more material for the worms to eat. That's all you're doing. You're feeding your worms, basically. Just make sure you keep them wet. You don't want to drench them. You don't want to drown them, but you want to mist them. You want to keep it with a little bit of moisture so that they can drink. Okay? And you'll be harvesting great fertilizer out of there. Worm castings like you wouldn't believe. If you get on that scale, then it makes sense to start bagging them up and selling the worm castings as a business if you want to. Or if you're like me, I've got a 30-acre place here where I live. I've got multiple fields, okay? So I have a huge garden, and I have 2 orchards where I have different fruit trees, and I have a walnut tree, several walnut trees, and I have 1 pecan tree on my property. And I also have, like I said, the orchards that have peach trees, apple trees, cherry trees. I have 2 plum trees, and I have multiple blackberry bushes. Now, if you're getting yourself a bunch of worm castings and a bunch of compost by doing this, then if you're not going to sell it, that's fine. If you're like me and you have a place where you have a lot of gardens and a lot of fruit trees and nut trees and all that, then you can use your compost and your worm castings on your own property. That's what I do. I don't sell any of it. I keep every bit I can make, and I wish I could make more. I'm always trying to figure out ways that I can, make more compost or better compost, or, what I can do. And so I use all of the stuff that I make here on my own property for my own gardens and my own trees, and I grow some really good veggies. I mean, I did let me see, three years ago, I think it was, about 3 years ago, I did a couple 1,000 pounds of vegetables. That's not counting, the fruit trees and nut trees, none of that. That's just my garden of veggies. I mean, I had corn, I had squash, I had zucchini, tomatoes, green beans. I grew broccoli for the first time a couple years ago, and that was a mixed bag because broccoli straight from your garden is unbelievable. I mean, I like broccoli anyway. Broccoli's yummy, but the broccoli that I pulled out of my own garden was absolutely the best broccoli I've ever had in my life. It was amazing. But the problem is you don't get a whole lot of it per plant. So it's one of those things you got to plant a whole lot of. But I mean, I grow all kinds of stuff, and I grow very large vegetables, and they're very healthy vegetables, and I really have a lot of success. And I think a lot of that is because of the different fertilizers you can use and stuff. I mean, this process of making compost, making worm castings, it's the best organic and natural way possible to feed your garden. I mean, you will be surprised at the amount of veggies that you pull out of your ground. I mean, it will just shock you, the size of these things. I mean, I was pulling zucchinis out, and I'm not lying to you, they look like small watermelons. They were humongous. And I love zucchini. I love to dice up zucchini, throw it in a pan. It's wonderful. And it just shocked me, the size of these things. My corn was wonderful. My corn was huge. Everything I grew was great. And a lot of that is what you're using in your garden. Okay. Another trick for your compost pile is wood ash. If you see, I have a wood stove. Okay, so I burn firewood to heat my home. I have other heat as well. I have electric heat too. But I like to burn the wood stove because I don't think anything feels like wood heat. That's just the best heat in my opinion. because it really gets inside of you and warms you up. But if you have a wood stove like I do, or a fireplace, then what you can do is when you clean out that wood stove, all that wonderful ash that you get, most people just take that and dump it into a pile, and they don't do anything with it. But wood ash is a wonderful thing to add to your compost pile because it is so rich in several different really important nutrients for your garden and for your plants. So adding that into your compost pile will really get it rolling, and it'll just raise the nutrient level in your pile so much. So, and that equates directly to your garden, because you got to think the compost that you make, the richer and more nutrient rich it is, the better. Because when you put that on your garden, then those nutrients are going to be used by your plants, and then that will go into your vegetables that you're picking. So the vegetables that you eat are going to have the nutrients from your compost in them. So the better compost you can make means you're going to have better plants, which means you're going to have better vegetables, which means you're going to have a better life. You're going to be healthier because you're going to get a lot more vitamins and nutrients from your veggies, basically. I mean, that's the easiest way to say it. So that goes back to your compost. And wood ash is one of those things that not a lot of people add to their compost pile because they don't even realize, I think, that they can. But not only can you, but I definitely recommend it. That's what I use my wood ash for. I put it in my compost pile because it adds so much to it. And the great thing about wood ash, as opposed to just putting the wood itself in, is the wood ash is already broken down, okay, because it's been burnt. And you know how when you dehydrate something, all you're doing is sucking the water out of it, but you're concentrating all of the nutrients when you dehydrate something. It's almost the same kind of thing when you burn wood, because you are burning part of the wood away, but the good stuff of the wood stays and it gets concentrated down in that ash. So when you put that ash on your compost pile and it's already broken down because it's been burnt, so it doesn't take a whole lot to turn that into compost, and it just enriches your compost pile like you wouldn't believe. Now you can also take wood ash and you can add it directly to your garden. Okay, you don't have to put it in your compost if you don't want to. You can add it directly to your garden, directly to your fruit trees, and it will help. But you have to be careful if you do that, because you can't add too much at once. Because if you add too much at once, it could fry your plants, and you don't want that. So the better way to do it, I think, in my opinion, is to put it in your compost pile, because when you put it in your compost pile, it gets diluted in your whole pile, so that it doesn't, isn't such a shock to your plants when you put it directly on your garden. So I would recommend using your wood ash in your compost pile because it helps it break down faster, adds nutrients to it, and it won't be such a shock to your garden. So we've covered the 3 types of composting worms. Now there's probably more than 3, but those are the main 3. Now 2 of them, the African Nightcrawler and the European Nightcrawler, I want to make something really clear. Those are not your normal nightcrawlers that you find when you go out looking for worms, okay? When it's a rainy day and you walk outside and you find worms that are, laying in the puddles or laying around on the ground or whatever that have come up, and you grab those to go fishing with, and those night crawlers, those are not the same kind of night crawlers as the composting night crawlers. Okay, the African and the European night crawlers are composting worms. They're different than the regular night crawlers. And a lot of people don't realize that you have to have composting worms in order to compost with worms. You can't put earthworms or regular night crawlers you buy at the bait shop into your compost pile and expect them to do the composting job of composting worms. That's not what they do. Different worms have different jobs. Like the night crawlers and the earthworms, what they do is you can put those directly in your garden if you want, those worms, because they tunnel. That's what they do. They tunnel down through your garden and it's basically nature's way of tilling the soil for you. So what they do is they tunnel down through the hard clay of the soil of your garden, and they aerate it, they loosen it up. Okay, what that does is it creates all these really wonderful little channels going down underneath of your garden. And that way when you water your garden, or when it rains, instead of the water just laying on top and only a little bit of it absorbing, what happens is it will soak down into the ground, and it'll find those channels that the worms have created underground, and it will flow down those channels just like it's a river flowing down through the channel that a river cuts through the ground. Okay, it'll flow right through those channels, and that enables your root systems of your plants in your garden to access that water and to be healthy and happy. And that's what we want, is healthy, happy plants. Because healthy and happy plants mean healthy, happy vegetables, which means healthy and happy people, which is what we all want to be. So those worms, earthworms and nightcrawlers, that's the job they do in your garden, okay? Now you can also add composting worms, such as the red wiggler and the African and European nightcrawlers. You can add those to your garden as well if you wanted to. They will survive in your garden, but you have to make sure that you have plenty of organic material in your garden for them to eat. So in other words, you're going to have to put lots of stuff on your garden for the worms to feed on. Basically, you're going to have to put leaves, you're going to have to put compost down there, you're going to have to put, you know, any of the things that I've already said 100 times now of what you put in your compost pile for the worms to eat. You're going to have to put that kind of stuff on your garden so that the worms will have something to eat. Because if you don't, they'll leave. They won't stay in your garden. They'll take off. They'll make a run for it. They'll go somewhere where there's something for them to eat. Which, you know, makes total sense, because nothing's going to stick around if it doesn't have food, you know. So that's important. So I guess the most important things to know about raising worms, if you're raising composting worms, is you have to make sure there's food, you have to make sure there's water. And that's pretty much any living creature you have to do that for. But if you don't have plenty of food, and if you don't make sure that you're misting, you know, your bin, or that you're watering your compost pile, then your worms are going to die because they don't have the water. Now in your compost pile, you have a little bit better chance because that'll also get rain, okay? And when you water your compost pile, that moisture will stay in your compost pile a lot longer. Okay, the core of your compost pile gets a lot hotter, so the water there will evaporate and it'll dry out. But on the edges of your compost pile, they'll stay nice and damp for quite a long time. So that'll provide a water source for your composting worms so that they don't dry out. Now, if you have a bin, you have to be a little bit more on top of it. You got to make sure that you check. I check every day. If I'm running a bin, I'll check every day and make sure that there's enough water in it. Now, when I say enough water in it, I want to be really clear, because I don't want anybody to think that you need an inch or two of water inside of your worm bin. Okay, that's way too much water. You're going to kill your worms. Okay, what you want to do is you want to get a little spray bottle, okay? You can pick them up at Walmart or the Dollar Tree or someplace like that for $1 or less. All it is, it's one of those little bottles that you pour water in and you screw the lid on, and it has a little trigger thing that you can squeeze that mists out the water. Lots of times girls use them for their hair. You can mist stuff out of them. That's what you need. You get one of those and you just mist your bin until it's a little bit damp. That's what you want to do. If you get too much water where there's actually standing water in your bin, you're going to kill your worms. Now remember when I told you in the beginning, when you're making a bin, you're going to drill holes for drainage. That is to ensure that the proper amount of water is in your bin. Okay, because you don't want too much, because if you have too much, your worms will die. So what that does is allow the excess water to drain down out of your bin, and that'll collect down in the bottom bin. And the top bin will just stay damp. The material that you put in there for them to eat will stay damp. And they'll have the perfect amount to drink and they won't get drowned. Now that water that goes down into that bottom bin, when you look at it, you're going to notice it's not clear water anymore, especially if you've had your worm bin running for a while, because it's going to be filtered through the worm castings, okay? So it's going to be dark like muddy water is what it's going to look like. Now what you've actually just created without knowing it is what they call worm tea, okay? I don't know if you guys have ever heard of compost tea, but that's something you do by taking compost and putting it in a bucket and adding water to it. It creates compost tea that you can water your garden with, and it'll really give a boost to your plants' immune systems and help them grow and make them strong. Okay, you can do the same thing with worm castings. And if you have a worm bin, one advantage to it is you have that bottom collection bin underneath of it. And when you water your bin, the excess water will get filtered down through the worm castings, and it will go down through the holes that you've created in your bin and collect in the bottom container. And in that bottom bin, you drain that water out of there into a like a bucket or a watering can or whatever you want. It doesn't matter. You can put it in a cup if you want. It doesn't matter. As long as you collect that water, you don't want to get rid of that water. That's not waste. That's really good stuff you've just made. So definitely keep it. And you want to take that out and you want to pour it on your garden. Because what has happened is a lot of those nutrients that make worm casting so amazing for your garden, they will also be in that liquid at the bottom because it's washed down through. It's the same process. The reason they call it worm tea is because it's the same process as making tea at your house or making coffee, where you run water down over the grounds or the tea leaves, and what comes out into your pot or your cup is tea or coffee. Same principle here. You are creating tea basically with your worm castings. Now this tea will have, like I said, all the goodness of the worm casting. So when you take that and you put it on your trees or your plants or whatever, it will give them a major boost. And because it's in liquid form as opposed to the original form of like dirt looking stuff, because it's liquid, the plants can absorb it very quickly. Okay, so instead of slowly absorbing the nutrients over time, which is what happens when you use compost or worm castings on your garden, the worm tea or the compost tea, either one you make, the roots of the plants can actually get a hold of those nutrients right away and bring them in right away. So it's an instant super boost to your plants. So one great thing to do is if you notice that your garden or your fruit trees are looking kind of bad, you know, they're kind of limp, their color's not very vibrant, they're just not growing the way you want them. And anybody that has a garden or that does this on a slightly regular basis, you kind of get a feeling. You know what your vegetables are supposed to look like. You know what the plants are supposed to look like. You know what the leaves are supposed to look like. You know when something's wrong. You know when it's not growing quite the way it should grow, okay? So when that happens, the very best thing you can do is mix up some worm tea or some compost tea. If you don't have worm castings, do compost tea. If you have worm castings, absolutely do worm tea. And then pour that over your plants in your garden, the ones that are having trouble. And I'm telling you, within 2 days, it's going to be a brand new plant. Within 2 days, that thing is going to perk up. It's going to look strong and healthy. It's going to start growing like crazy. And the color is going to be very, very vibrant. And it's going to look like you've used like Miracle Grow on steroids. You know what I mean? It's going to look like you're the best gardener in the world. And that's what you feel like sometimes when you use this stuff. It's literally so good. It's almost like a magic trick when you use this stuff on your plants. So whenever you get in a situation like that, always remember that you can make yourself some tea up using your worm castings or your compost, and you can save that plant. It doesn't have to die. You can save it. You can make it way better. Now, if you make compost tea or worm tea on a regular basis and you feed it to your garden, like on a weekly basis, not to correct some problem, not because your plants are in trouble, but just as a supplement to your garden. Okay, if you do that once a week, your vegetables are going to be insanely large and very tasty and wonderful, and their plants are going to be so healthy, and they're going to grow very quickly. Okay, if you do it once a week, you can even fit in 2 growings if you start in the beginning of the season. Then you'll actually be able to fit 2 whole cycles in to 1 growing season, to where you can plant your garden, grow it to term, harvest your vegetables, clear out all the plants, put those back in another compost pile for next year so it can get working and make more compost, and then replant, and then grow your vegetables in your garden to term again and harvest them again. So you'll actually get 2 whole growing seasons in 1 growing season if you supplement your garden weekly, especially with worm tea. If you do it weekly, you'll just be blown away. But you can also do it with compost tea. It's just not going to be as quick or as good as with worm tea, simply because of the difference in the 2. Compost is wonderful, but it's not worm castings. Worm castings are the best thing in the world. So an easy way, I just realized I didn't even tell you how to make compost tea or worm tea. So let me do that real quick. I already told you, if you have the worm bin, you're going to be collecting worm tea underneath. Now, it's not going to be a large amount. Okay, it's just going to be whatever water comes through the holes that's extra. If you want to create your own worm tea or compost tea, here's what you do. You get yourself a 5-gallon bucket. Okay, you can buy those at Walmart, at Home Depot, at Lowe's, those kind of places. You can buy them for like $2. Okay, $2-3, something like that. So you get yourself a 5-gallon bucket. If you're making compost tea, okay, you get yourself a shovel, just a normal shovel, and you put 1 or 2 shovelfuls of compost in the bottom of your 5-gallon bucket. Then you fill the rest of the bucket up with water, and you stir it around, and you let it steep, just like you let your tea steep when you make tea. Okay, you let it steep, you give it a really, really, really good stir, make sure it's stirred up well, and then you take that 5-gallon bucket and you just pour that over your garden. Okay, now what I suggest doing, and you don't have to do it this way, you can simply dump the bucket if you want, but what I suggest doing is you take that bucket and you dump the water into a watering can, and then once you have that water in the watering can, then you use the watering can to apply it to your garden. That way you can really control the flow of water, and you can control how much goes in one spot. It's a lot harder to regulate the flow when you're just dumping it out of a 5-gallon bucket. And it doesn't take too many times of accidentally dumping half a bucket in one little spot for you to realize that you need to find a better way to do it. Trust me. From experience, trust me, you don't want to do that. So I always dump it in, pour it into the watering can first, and then I apply it to the garden from the watering can. Now that takes a little bit longer because you have to make several trips to do it. But I think it's better. It's much more even coverage. It'll help a lot. Now they make little fancy doohickeys that you can pour your compost tea into, and you can actually hook it up to the hose, and you can spray it just like you have a paint sprayer. Okay, I don't mess with that kind of stuff. I'm not one of those guys that's going to pay a lot of money for gadgets to use. You know what I mean? When you can do it a simple way. So I say a good old-fashioned watering can does the trick. Now, if you're making worm tea, it's different than compost tea. Okay? The basic idea is the same. You're going to do basically the same thing. The process is the same. The exception is how much you use, okay? You're not going to use 2 big shovelfuls of worm castings to make a 5-gallon bucket of worm tea. You're just not going to. It's too much. You can get by with less. I use a shovelful, whereas with compost tea, I use 2 shovelfuls. So that's what I do. You need to find your own sweet spot. Everybody's different. I'm not going to tell you this is exactly how much you need to use. But I find 1 shovelful is plenty, because worm compost, worm castings are a lot stronger than regular compost, so you can get by with using a little bit less. But you do the same thing. You fill the bucket with water, you stir it around real good, and then you put that in a watering can and you put it out over top of your garden, and it works wonders for you. Like I said, the worm tea is going to do a lot better than the compost tea. The compost tea is going to do a lot better than just putting the compost onto the garden. So that's a couple different ways, and it's great when your plants are in danger to do it as a treatment. But if you do it once a week, you'll see just an amazing transformation in your garden. And what it really does also, another extra little benefit that you never would really actually consider, is it kind of gets you excited about gardening. You know what I mean? It gets you excited about it, because we've all had those seasons where you plant things and they just don't come up, For me, it's been habanero peppers. I just can't grow them. I can grow jalapeno peppers. I can grow green peppers. I can grow red peppers. I can grow every other kind of damn pepper in the world that I've ever tried to grow. But I cannot grow habanero peppers. They just will not grow at my house. I don't know why. I've tried everything in the world to make them grow, and they won't grow. We've all had those different kinds of plants, and we've all had those moments where we plant a garden and it just doesn't work out the way we wanted it to. Now, using the compost tea and the worm tea, you can greatly improve your odds of a successful garden. I mean, by a factor of thousands. And what that does is it gets you stoked and excited about gardening. Because when things don't go your way and your garden doesn't grow, and it's just wimpy little plants, almost no veggies, you get discouraged and you think, what the hell, man? Why am I wasting my time? This is a hell of a lot of work for no return, But when your garden is lush and it looks like the Garden of Eden, you get excited and you're like, I can't wait to plant another garden. This is great. And you get all these amazing veggies that you get to eat, and it's great. So that's another little added benefit. So I hope that I've been able to pass along some good information to you guys on this show. I hope you learned something about vermiculture. And it's surprising to me that a lot of people don't even know this exists, Now, don't get me wrong, there are people that do. If you go on YouTube and you look it up, there's lots of different videos on it, because it's really starting to get to be a popular thing. But there's a lot of people out there that have no idea. They go to the store and they pay a lot of money to buy chemical fertilizers, and they put that on their gardens. And now, a chemical fertilizer, it might make your garden grow. That is true. It will make your plants grow. But you got to think, anything you put on your plants, you're putting in your body as well. Okay, you're eating those vegetables, and they're going to suck up whatever you've put in your garden. So you want to make sure what you put in your garden is good, clean, organic stuff. You don't want a bunch of chemicals, because if you start using that, that's going into your body too. Okay? People don't think of it that way, but you really should. Because, like they say, you are what you eat, and it affects your health. So you want to make sure that what you use is going to be safe and it's going to be healthy. At least the best possible chance that it will be. And that's why I think composting is the way to go. And I think, vermiculture is the way to go. So I hope that you guys learned something on this show. I hope you enjoyed it. It's always difficult when I do shows like this, because it's it's one of those things that not a lot of people are into. You know what I mean? So it's kind of a niche, and you really have to be into that niche to enjoy the show. But I try to make it, interesting and entertaining. I try not to be like that guy that does those commercials for dry, itchy eyes. I try not to be monotone and boring. I try to make it, so you can listen to it and enjoy it a little bit. And I hope you learned something, and I really hope that you take this information and you get out there and you start composting yourself, because it's really easy to do. I mean, it doesn't take a lot. It's literally just adding the proper stuff and going to town. That's all it is. And it just happens. It's wonderful. And if you are in the position to actually get yourself some worms, there's a lot of different places you can order them online. Some gardening stores will even have them. You want your red wigglers, your African nightcrawlers, and your European nightcrawlers. Out of the three of them, I recommend the red wigglers because they eat the most and they reproduce the fastest. So that's going to give you the best bang for your buck. But if you want a multi-purpose worm, I'd go with the African or the European nightcrawler because they get a lot bigger and they make great bait. So if you're a person that likes to fish, then that's the way you should go, because you can also use all your excess worms that you keep getting, because you're going to get to a point where you get a lot more worms than you need. So you can start using them as bait, you know what I mean, if you're into fishing with worms. So anyway, thank you for joining me for the show. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're listening to this on YouTube right now, then please hit like and subscribe to the channel and check out our other videos, man. I put all the different shows from the network I put on YouTube. So you'll get the Staring Into the Abyss, which is our paranormal show. You'll get We're Screwed. You'll get Ant-Man Sports Show, which is actually coming up next in a few minutes. You'll get all those on the YouTube channel. So if you ever miss a show, go to YouTube, type in a search James Hershey Jr., that's my name, and you'll find all the videos. James Hershey Jr. Thank you guys for joining me. I love you. I appreciate you. And until next time, bye-bye.